On behalf of the CSMVS, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangralaya, formerly known as the Prince of Wales Museum of Western India, and the Museum Society of Bombay, I extend a very, very warm welcome to Dr. Sudev Sheth for being with us here this evening and going to give us a very fascinating lecture. I'm not going to say anything more than that. Bear with me, those who are not our members and those who are our members know what I'm going to say just now. Late last night, we lost a very, very dear and staunch supporter of the Museum Society of Mumbai, Mr. Shailesh Mahadevia. And we will be having a formal meeting on the 15th amongst the committee and the members to condole his death. Today is the first time we are meeting after this sad event. So bear with me while I announce the regret and the passing away of Mr. Shailesh Mahadevia on Sunday, 5th January 2025. He served on our Museum Society Executive Committee for many, many years, but travel restrictions and health issues eventually limited his involvement in our daily activities. He showed a strong sense of interest in our work and truly provided us guidance to the executive committee members, especially in subjects of finance and investments. Even though our investments are not in very large amounts, he gave us the right guidance, and we truly appreciated that. He used to come every Saturday morning to our little office, which is at the other end of this campus, and we didn't have a refrigerator then, and we don't have a refrigerator now as well. I refuse to gift one to them because we have to be very careful with electrical appliances in a property like this, and one freak accident of a short circuit and this monumental building will be in jeopardy. So that was the reason, but Shailesh Bhai would come. We did have a kettle which we'd plug in, and disposable tea and coffee and sugar sachets, but Shailesh Bhai would bring a tiny, it was a miniature old-fashioned Bombay milk bottle. I don't know where he got it from. And he'd have his tea. But he took care of so many things for us because we're a volunteer-based organization. We just have 2 interns who we train up every 3 years while they're doing their undergraduate. And we have somebody to help us keep the office clean. So we really appreciated him. We knew he would be there at 10:30 on Saturday mornings till 1 o'clock and take care of filling up forms. To Mudit Sears, this will be music, issuing the membership cards, etc. So we have really lost an exceptional individual, and he will be deeply missed. We honor Shailesh Bhai's contributions, dedication, and kindness to our society with heartfelt gratitude and the utmost respect. Our society will mourn the loss of a distinguished, generous, and admirable member of our community, and we will be conveying this to his wife, Neela Mahadevia, who's a wonderful, wonderful mother, spouse, and grandmother, and to his daughter, Yudita, who lives in Bangalore, but who spent a considerable length of time with him here during his brief illness. So thank you for bearing with me. And thank you, Museum Society members whose condolences have started pouring in since this morning. And I've told Mrs. Mahadevia I'll compile them for her and forward it along with our resolution. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm just going to say a few words about Dr. Sudev. I know he has many, many friends here, but he needs a little bit of introduction to our members here. And I'm going to be brief. He's a senior lecturer in history at the Joseph H. Lauder Institute of Management and International Studies and in the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches across the School of amazing: arts, science, and the Wharton School. It's a real accomplishment and a credit to share your lectures and your knowledge with students from the humanities, the sciences, and the business school. He was previously on the faculty at Harvard Business School, where he held the Harvard Newcomen Fellowship in Business History. After the lecture, Dr. Dinyar Patel, who's equally distinguished and extremely well known for his monumental research on Dadabhai Nauroji, not one volume like this, but 2 volumes to follow. So Dinyar is an associate professor of South Asian history at the S.P. Jain Institute of Management and Research here in Bombay. And thank you for volunteering so wholeheartedly to conduct the discussion after the lecture and the Q&A, if there's time, as you said. She's not here today, but it was Shefali Shah who introduced me to Sudev, and I'm most grateful to her for that. She too had some domestic, she had a crisis this afternoon, and she said she couldn't join us today. But if it wasn't for her, you and I wouldn't have met, or we wouldn't have met as early as we did in our lives. So I must remember and thank Shefali. So I don't know how many of you have seen his book or read his book. It doesn't matter, I have. I promptly got it. And it is amazing. It is packed. As an English friend of mine said, it's really dense. I said, what do you mean dense? It's got so much information. But you really need to be a student to appreciate, at any age you need to be a student to appreciate what has gone into this book. You know, in the first 20 pages, he's got a genealogy which is astounding, absolutely astounding. He shares his insights on bankrolling empires, family fortunes, and political transformation in Mughal India. And this book is published last year by the Cambridge University Press. It demonstrates how a family of diamond dealers deployed wealth and information to maneuver around political leaders and survive the collapse of the Mughal Empire and the rise of the native princes and the British East India Company. The story highlights the unique role played by Gujarati bankers in the practice of government and by Indian and colonial rulers. The sources of information are mind-boggling, and I was particularly intrigued. I don't read either ancient Persian or modern Persian, but he's been through the Persian diaries in great detail, which contributes a lot. And of course, Gujarati poems and French trading manuals. So I think you speak 5 languages.
I can at least read them.
At least you can read them. It's a labor of love, and of course we know what the word Jhaveri means. And the Hari Bhakti generation, which is present here today, and business families from Ahmedabad and across Gujarat who shaped state power and society through their capital and their networks. He's going to tell us, which is very important, how they negotiated with politicians and what insights can we gain for our very own times. I just want to show you the genealogy, and I'm going to hand you over. We all know the Mughal genealogy. XX22, I immediately went there. So this is the Mughal genealogy, which we all know. Then this is the Jhaveri family tree. It's parallel, it runs parallel, which is really fascinating. And then we have the Gaikwar family tree, which again runs parallel, and the Hari Bhakti family tree. And I'm sure you must be having your family trees tied up in red potleys somewhere, and save them and guard them and pass it on to the next generation, because this history has to be told. And I really, really appreciate that you have done this for the community and for scholarship in general.
Good evening. Thank you to the Museum Society and this beautiful venue for inviting me and having me. Special thanks to Firoza Godrej for the invitation, and also my colleague and friend Dinyar Patel for agreeing to serve as moderator at the end of the talk. I'm very interested in hearing from the audience, both questions, feedback, comments, so I'll try my level best to speak for about 45 minutes so that we have enough time for a dialogue and a conversation at the end of this. So rather than jump into a standard academic talk and tell you the debates that I'm encountering and my interventions in those debates, if I do that, half of you might fall asleep in the first 5 minutes. Let me start in a very different place, which is how did I come to study this topic and why did it capture my imagination? In 2008, I finished an undergraduate degree at UC Berkeley in California. I'm born and brought up in North America. My parents reside in California, and I grew up with a deep interest in Indian music and culture. I'm a student of music as well. As I was finishing my undergraduate degree, I had two very well-known professors, Munis Farooqi and Vasudha Dalmia, who said that if I really wanted to study and understand India, it would not be enough to sit on the hilltops of Berkeley, California, but I must come live, study, travel, love in India. So I purchased a one-way ticket with the blessings of my parents to New Delhi to begin a master's degree in modern Indian history. After arriving in India, unknown to my parents, I purchased a motorcycle and I started traveling across the city and gradually getting braver and braver and finding my way to nearby towns. What you are immediately struck with when you're a young person in Delhi is that remnants of the past are very visible. They're all around one. On top of those motorcycle rides, I took weekend excursion trips with my classmates to places like Fatehpur Sikri, pictured here on the left, the iconic Taj Mahal monument, pictured second, and also to the various museums that were scattered in New Delhi. In those museums, I encountered miniature paintings from the 16th and 17th centuries capturing a beautiful bygone era. So here's a picture of Akbar, a Mughal emperor, engaging with Jesuit priests at the court, discussing religious ideas, and of course my favorite, imperial feasting in the 1600s. 1600s, by the way, for those of you who love potatoes and tomatoes, they were unknown to Indians prior to 1600. These are New World crops. So these miniature paintings captured the influx of New World commodities like potatoes and tomatoes and turkeys and pineapples to Indian society, and how the Mughals reflected on these newfound joys in their life. Before I say much more about this particular landscape, let me say that even though I was a student of modern history, I was a bit promiscuous. I used to sneak out of those classes and spend time with the professors teaching medieval Indian history. I felt that those teaching medieval history had to use a bit more imagination in telling tales, because the source material is not as robust for that time period as it is for a later period. Much like our own storytelling in modern times, when the facts are thin, you have to use imagination, and in some cases, far-fetched imagination. So that captured my interest, and I found myself spending a lot of time in courses and classes about medieval Indian history. Sure. For those who are not familiar with the Mughal Empire, let me just give you a brief synopsis. So the Mughal Empire is a 16th century empire that is known for harnessing agrarian surplus and building institutions in a very short period of time. The founders of the Mughal Empire come from modern-day Uzbekistan, Fergana Valley, and they found India to be a place of immense opportunity. In fact, they learned about India for the first time in the bazaars of Kabul. And in Kabul, bazaar gossip suggested that India was a place of immense wealth, immense color, and immense surplus, and that those who were strapped for resources in Central Asia ought to look to India for better opportunities. It is in this context that in 1526, after 4 attempts prior, Babur, for the 5th attempt, was successful in establishing a small political organization just out of Agra. Now, Babur was not very fond of India. India didn't have any particularly tasty fruits. It didn't have warm baths, which they were used to in Central Asia. They felt that the humid climate was not very suitable for building houses and left a detrimental effect on weaponry. So as far as environment, India was not particularly pleasant. But Babur, being an astute warlord and astute political entrepreneur, did notice something. And it is in this observation that the seeds of the Mughal Empire were sown. What did he notice? Well, he noticed that India had sophisticated counting systems. And for him, this suggested that there was immense wealth to be had in this particular part of the world. The moment a society is able to establish sophisticated counting mechanisms, that suggest that something has to be counted or something is being counted. And typically in this case, it's wealth. So in a short period of time, Babur, his descendants, especially his grandson Akbar, relied on a combination of military entrepreneurship, if you want to use a euphemistic term, or straight war to consolidate influence and authority in and around Agra and Delhi. And they used administrative skills and administrative structures to ensure that more and more people were a part of their political world. So to put it in modern context, the Mughal Empire gradually became the best employer to work for in a very short period of time, so much so that it attracted talent from very far and wide. Poets, architects, writers, military men, etc., found their way from Central Asia, which was much less resourced, and they headed towards India. So Delhi, Agra had a kind of pull from all its surrounding areas. Now, if you look at the map here, you can see that there's a very thin sliver of land connecting northern India, Uttar Pradesh and Haryana, to Central Asia. But north of that and south of that is rugged terrain. And it is through this thin strip of land that most migrants made their way to the subcontinent. Now, although the high tide or the peak of the Mughal Empire has inspired historians for a very long time, and much of what we know about the Mughal Empire comes from this high tide period of courtly life and courtly culture, I was inspired by another aspect of the Mughal Empire. Right? As a student driving around a motorcycle in Delhi, looking at these wonderful monuments like Humayun's tomb, for example, I used to ask myself, where did the Mughals actually go? If they were so mighty and so powerful, what happened to them? To give you a sense visually what I was thinking about as I embarked on this question, let me show you a map of the last 5 decades of the Mughal Empire. And this will give you a sense of the kind of visual imagery that was occupying my mind at the time. So here's Aurangzeb's reign, and you can see expansion efforts to the south. But as he's expanding south, a Swiss cheese model appears up north, where they're losing control over existing strongholds. For those in the world of business, you know if you expand too quickly, and if you're underfinanced, what the consequences might be. So here you have, by the 18th century, Mughal atrophy at its best, and you have an empire that is shrinking very, very quickly. So equipped with this mental map of what happened to the Mughal Empire in the 18th century, I embarked on a journey of research with 2 questions in my mind. The first question was a very simple or seemingly simple question, and it was empirical in nature, meaning I wanted to understand from the evidence, how did localities experience a deteriorating Mughal administration? In other words, how did local people experience an imperial power that was slowly losing grip over empire? And the second question, as a historian, we are interested in explaining change. The question was, what happened in the aftermath of Mughal power, right? So what are the processes by which other groups, I'm calling them regional warlords here, and then leaders of the British East India Company, how did they consolidate their power and influence in the aftermath of Mughal power? Typically, Indian history is divided into 3 periods. You all know this because you've studied in India: ancient, medieval, and modern, and the 3 never speak to each other. But in my case, I was very curious to learn about how this transition from so-called medieval India to modern India actually happens. It's not a brick wall. So then what are the mechanisms by which this happens? To give you another mental imagery, how do you go from a world that looks something like this on the left of the screen, which is a Mughal empire that's controlling most of the subcontinent, to one by the mid-1750s where you have several native confederacies, for example, the Marathas in this part of the world, the Sikhs up north, and so on and so forth, to then one where in less than 100 years from the first map, you have what might resemble your grandmother's quilt, right? A patchwork quilt of overlapping political organizations that are seeking to control Indian resources. Okay? So a world where you have an empire that's dominant to a world where you have multiple aspirants to political power vying for authority, vying for influence, and most importantly, vying for your taxes. Okay? So some of these questions I explore in my new book, Bankrolling Empire, which you've seen and is available in the back. This book is really about this transition period and how we can explain this transition. Now, as I started out on this journey, I was agnostic to explanations, meaning I was not concerned with money necessarily. I was not necessarily concerned with institutions. I was not necessarily concerned with political leaders. I had an open mind, and I was just looking to find the evidence that would give me the most convincing explanation for how this change happens. Existing scholarship has tackled this question in different ways. So for example, some have argued that it was corruption among the Mughal nobility that prevented it from expanding and growing and sustaining itself. Others have argued that it was military failures. The Mughals failed to adopt new technology, for example, handgun technology. Typically, if you look at armies around the world, those who adopt handguns quickly also benefit from organizational gains that come with a more disciplined army. So the Mughals did not do that. That's a second kind of explanation. And third, and I think the most interesting explanation, is from Munis Farooqi, who's a professor at UC Berkeley, who suggested that the decline of Mughal infighting, the decline of fighting between brothers for the throne, and brothers actually surviving, was detrimental to Mughal political culture. So for those of you who are in family businesses or no family businesses where infighting is part and parcel of daily life, that might be a healthy indicator of things going well, okay, if you believe that argument. So these are some arguments that are out there, and they're all correct in their own way, but I thought they were partial in their explanation. There had to be a much more complete explanation for how this transition happens. So as a young graduate student, I was inspired by a professor. Her name is Samira Sheikh, who's a professor at Vanderbilt, who said to me that when I was a student at MS University in Baroda, a member of a business family, the Hari Bhakti family, donated a large corpus of materials which was given to the university, but unfortunately it was locked up, and no one has really looked at it. I believe it is still locked up, but I can make a phone call if you're interested. Do you want to go check it out? So with nothing better to do in my life in 2014, one summer, I asked my university for some money. I bought a ticket to India, and I ended up going to that particular archive. So venturing into archives like this is an extreme sport, by the way. You encounter all kinds of animals, all kinds of silverfish, all kinds of dust. And Dinyar knows this, we talked about this on the way here. You often fall sick because these materials are from the 18th century and they've been locked up for a very long time. So that's why I'm saying it's an extreme sport. But what I learned from this particular exercise is that for the 19th century, so the period about, let's say 1800 onward, we do have robust materials from Indian business families that tell a very interesting story. Okay? What I learned is that if you want to study state power, the Mughals, for example, or their successors, you cannot only examine the materials that the Mughals themselves produce. You must examine materials of other powerful groups, allied groups, specialist groups who are servicing the state as well. So who are the people involved in running state operations? It is often their archives and their materials that will shed much greater light on state power. Most states and most political organizations would like to overstate how powerful they are and how influential they are. So you have to look at allied materials. I also learned a very hard lesson that my friends studying Europe and early America, for example, had ready-made archives to study. If you're studying the Medicis, for example, in Italy, if you're studying the Rothschilds in France and England, if you're studying the Fugger family in Germany, for example, you not only have ready-made archives, you also have hit television shows. So hopefully in the future we will have a hit television show featuring the Javeris or the Hari Bhaktis. I'm not sure. But just to give you a contrast, that we know very little about financial specialists in our part of the world because A, the archives are scattered and limited, and because we have not spent enough time valuing such material. Okay? So that just gives you a sense of the 19th century for the large part, but this doesn't tell you anything about the Mughal period. So even though I was excited to spend a lot of time in this archive, I asked myself, this is a part of the story, the second half of the story. What about the first half of the story? If I'm curious about the Mughal Empire and what happened to it, are there financial groups involved in their statecraft and their governance? Because we know for the later period that certainly is the case. Unfortunately, most materials from the Mughal time period, and Babur was right, the humidity and environment has destroyed most of our historical texts, doesn't exist. So I had to be very, very creative. I had to rely on non-archival or non-financially oriented materials to build my own archive as such. And this is multilingual because there's no single set of language materials that speaks to this particular topic. So just to give you a sense of the range of materials that are represented in this book, I've broken it up into language categories. Now the ones in red are the ones that are really crucial to my work and the ones that I feel are new and different and might allow us to tell a very different story. I also learned through this that if you're looking for the same kind of material for economic history that you are looking for in Europe, for example, you're barking up the wrong tree. In South Asia, our literary conventions, our Sahitya, for example, has very sophisticated genres of writing that have very detailed descriptions of social life, but it might not be in the same way that you think of Western archives, with ledgers and with tallies. We have those too, but it is in fact in our poetry, in our prose, in our inscriptions, in our travel writing, in our diaries, in our prashastis, in our shlokas, for example, that a lot of interesting material is embedded. So that's what I learned as I was looking at this. I also learned that when you're reading such materials, if you're looking for numerical accuracy, you may not find it. To give you a small example, we have 3 chronicles documenting Akbar's attack on Chittor, the fort in Rajasthan. Each of those 3 chronicles are by 3 eyewitnesses, but they have vastly different numbers and figures for how many people were involved, how many people died. In fact, in our day-to-day conversation, we're very loose with how we talk about numbers, right? Kam, zyada, little bit, lot, dekhenge, itne baje pahunchenge, aas-paas, that kind of thing. And so that is part of our heritage and that is part of our culture. So if you're looking for pinpoint values, you may not find them. It is for that reason that in this book, I've tried to identify a different strategy, which is, can you identify financial relationships broadly speaking? So you may not be perfectly accurate in terms of determining at what percent a loan was taken or how much exactly the loan was, but you do have some sense of scale and scope. And I think that's a good place to start for Indian economic history. Now let me give you a sense of what the materials look like. You must be curious. I'm a historian, but you're also a historian. So you should look at these with a critical eye and tell me what comes to your mind when you're looking at them. Here's the first document. This is a loan document. And this is a loan that was given to Murad Baksh, Aurangzeb's brother, who eventually lost out to the throne. And this is a loan that documents Javeri wealth being given to this particular prince in his bid to become emperor. Now, this is a loan for 5.5 lakh rupees, or 550,000 rupees. To give you a sense of how much that is, that would sustain a provincial army in Gujarat for about a month. A kilogram of wheat, or I should say 10 kilograms of wheat, would cost about 1 rupee during this time. Processed indigo was about 5 to 10 rupees. Buying a slave would cost you 2 to 4 rupees. And an unskilled laborer would earn in dams. So 40 dams equals 1 rupee. A daily wage would be 2 dams. So 5.5 lakh rupees is a very sizable sum. And to be able to provide that money on the spot in a single go would not be an easy feat for any average merchant. So this is Shantidas Javeri's firm who's providing this. And I'll say more about Shantidas in a minute. I'm just giving you a sense of what the materials look like. And that was in Persian language. Here's a poem, a prashasti, in Sanskrit language. And I'm grateful to the Asiatic Society of Mumbai because I was able to source this from the library here in this very city. And this poem was initially an inscription on a Jain derasar, which was later destroyed by Aurangzeb. So we no longer have the derasar and we no longer have the temple, but we do have the prashasti, which is why our textual sources are very important. And historians are supposed to be unbiased and not have favorite sources, but I'm a bad historian. I have a favorite source, and this is my favorite source. This is an 18th century diary of a low-level Mughal official spanning 10 years, traveling between Surat, Khambat or Kambe, Baroda, and Ahmedabad. And for 10 years, he documents his life experiences, he compiles daily news reports, and he puts them together for us in the form of a diary. There's only one copy of this diary. It's in Persian language, and it's at the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. I like this diary in particular because we typically don't hear from low-level officials. I think to myself, if I were to write a diary about my experiences as an employee of a university, it might look something like this. It's an unfiltered diary of what I see and what I experience and what I hear. And this is how this man has compiled his news report. So it is through a deep reading of all these kinds of materials that I identified two very remarkable families involved in the politics of government in early times. The first family does not look like this, okay? But currently runs one of Asia's largest textile manufacturing firms and is one of India's most recognized brands. This is the Arvind Group based out of Ahmedabad. If you're wearing jeans to this talk today, it's possible that the denim comes from their factory. The early 20th century and modern iteration of the family looks something like this. This is Sanjay Lalbhai with his two sons, and they currently run the firm. And their Sanjay Bhai's grandfather, Kasturbhai Lalbhai, is pictured just north of him, having a conversation with an icon of Mumbai, J.R.D. Tata. So this is the early 20th century iteration of the family. Most historians would be satisfied with this level of history and this time period. But seeing that I'm truly passionate about an earlier period, this wasn't enough for me. So as I pushed further and further back, it turns out that their direct forefathers are actually more intrepid and possibly more interesting than their 20th century counterparts. This is Shantidas Jhaveri, a well-known diamond merchant and jeweler, and this is his grandson Kushal Chand. So to give you a sense of what the family genealogy looks like, if the red represents the jeans business, the blue represents their earlier businesses in diamond dealing, in political financing, in revenue farming. And I was able to reconstruct this for the first time in history by reading the Prashasti very closely, because that Prashasti, or the praise poem, outlines the genealogy and verifies scattered references elsewhere. So I believe this is the first time that we actually have a full genealogy of the Jhaveri family in this particular book. This family comes from a dry, arid place called Osai, which is where many Jain merchants came from in that period. Osai is a temple town, and most entrepreneurship there is tied to temple economy, but there were much greater opportunities to be had in Ahmedabad. If you're confused, this is India flipped on its head. And the reason I did that was to show you why Ahmedabad and Kambe became the natural landing spot for most of these merchants. If you look at Osai and you move south, Ahmedabad and Kambe, and then later Surat are natural places for merchants from this part of the world to land up on. So as I was examining these materials, I discovered that, hey, what happens if we start mapping relationships, as I mentioned, financial relationships is what interested me, to political leaders. And as Firoza nicely pointed out, if you do a one-to-one mapping, you'll see that the generations overlap and there's a lot of confluence in activity. So by anchoring my study across generations of this family, I could see the expansion and contraction of political power, both Mughals and its successors, in much greater dynamic. Right? To see something over time is very difficult to do, but when you start mapping generations to one another, it becomes a little bit easier. Now, for those who may not have the time to read my book cover to cover, and I don't blame you because I don't think my wife has read my book yet either. She falls asleep by page 6, so I don't blame you if you don't make it too far. But let me at least tell you what the argument is. So when you walk out of today's talk, and if you're having a cocktail or a cup of tea after, you have something to say, okay? The argument is broken up into 4 parts. And the first three parts are largely descriptive, and the fourth part is a resolution or a conclusion of sorts. And I use vocabulary from ecology and biology to kind of make sense of this relationship between business and power. So the first phase is courtly mutualism, and it's the idea that relationship between the Mughals and the Mughal court and any merchants were largely mutualistic because post-1600, these merchants were able to provide rare commodities, rare goods, luxury items, and certain services that the Mughal state desired and wanted. And that relationship was somewhat mutual because in return, the merchants got safe passage to trading ports, they got protection if their goods were compromised, and so on and so forth. The second phase, political commensalism, documents a shift, and the shift is fairly major. The shift is, as Mughal princes started vying for the throne and succession disputes became muddy and confused, they identified private capital and private wealth as the most important resource to win political battles. No surprise, in our modern times, election cycle season is when you need donations and you need capital. So this was the equivalent of a Mughal election season cycle. Initially, these merchants were asked politely, and these merchants also handed over the cash because it was politically advantageous to do so. But as money became the most critical resource in political life, we get a shift to phase 3, which is expedient extortion. Doesn't sound very good, right? It wasn't very good. These merchants were not only identified for their wealth, they were extorted publicly, they were humiliated, they were beaten, they were imprisoned, and they were whipped. The chronicles from this time period have a lot of discussion about merchants and bankers being kidnapped and being taken to other cities against their will. But merchants are not always innocent, right? It's a high risk, high reward game. For anyone in the business of finance and banking in this room, you might already know that it's inherently laden with risk, right? So you have to play that, and these merchants knew that. By the end of this, as merchants wisened up and as bankers wisened up, and as they realized that being extorted and being imprisoned was no way to live a life, they used their finance, they used their capital know-how and their merchant networks to start finding alternatives. And that is the world I'm calling competitive co-parcenary. It is a world where finance starts to become the most important tool in arbitrating difference and arbitrating resources among several competing groups. It is also the moment that financial futures, the idea of future revenues on something, becomes a very key part of the Indian imaginary. In an earlier period, you couldn't gain resources or you couldn't gain control of something if you just promised revenues 5 years down the line. You need revenues here and now, or at least in one season. But this is the first time that principles of finance and principles of contractual obligations become key. I'll say a bit more about this. Let me just walk you through each of these phases really quickly and give you a sense of the materials that I use to prove the point that I'm trying to make. So the first phase is courtly mutualism. Recall that courtly mutualism is simply the idea that business families and political power was in a song and dance that was beneficial to both sides. So here's the first farman that we have from 1618 from Jahangir to Shantidas Jhaveri. And this farman says, in the yellow, I'll just highlight it for you, that everyone should know that Shantidas Jhaveri, a resident of that province, which is Ahmedabad, has been placed under the protection of the pillar of the state, the governor Asif Khan. But in return for such prized protection, what does he have to do? He has to offer gifts and presents and every type of jewelry that he can procure to the exalted empire. And in exchange, no governors in the locality will interfere with his business. This is one example I'm giving you of what mutualistic relations look like in reality. Of course, mutualism, I'm being a little bit extreme in my characterization. It was not perfectly mutual. The Mughal state still had an upper hand, but for the most part, you can see that the merchants are also benefiting from that kind of relationship. Now, this is Persian, and you might say, well, this is just one side of the coin. What were other sources in this time period saying? Well, even the non-state sources, the Jain sources, which are under no direct political patronage, at least from the state, had a very similar take on this relationship. It was mutualistic in the Jain vision also. So here's an example from the Prashasti, that it was for the benefit of the universal kingdom, Samrajya, that on a particular date in 1627, Shah Jahan, the emperor, displayed his favor on Shantidas in the form of horses, elephants, and gifts, and he called it the little kingdom of Shantidas. So this is, you get a sense between the Persian materials and the Sanskrit materials, what this mutualistic relationship in Ahmedabad city might have looked like between a prominent merchant and the state. Now we see that this relationship shifts by the mid-17th century, 1658 or so, as these princes, right, Murad Bakhsh, Dara Shukoh, Aurangzeb, etc., are fighting for the throne. And as I mentioned, the Shantidas Javeri family places a bad bet. So for all of you political financiers out there, what happens if you pick the wrong horse and the horse doesn't win? Typically, you're out of luck. But you'll see here that political life was much more complicated than perhaps our own times. So here you have an example of a loan that's provided to Murad Bakhsh, and this is that same 5.5 lakh rupees, details of which how it's going to be paid back at the bottom. And it says that a considerable loan was taken from Manik Chand, the son of Shantidas and his brothers, at the place of accession at Ahmedabad. This is the epicenter of mankind, and this was in a manner of a loan. So this is the first document that we have that suggests that it was not a gift, it was actually a loan. And the details of how that loan is to be repaid are given in this endorsement and should be paid back from the revenues of the autumn season. Okay. So here you have an example of a loan being taken. Murad Bakhsh was eventually executed by Aurangzeb, and Shantidas shows up at the coronation of Aurangzeb and politely asks, what happened to that 5.5 lakh rupees that we donated or we gave to the family? And even though it was the wrong prince, the losing prince, Aurangzeb actually repaid that 5.5 lakh rupees, not because he was necessarily a good human being or a nice person, but because he knew that Shantidas had immense influence in the locality, much like a local accountant or financier or financial advisor or a lawyer, and said that as long as you go back to Ahmedabad and ensure that the rest of the merchants who follow you are also supporting the state, this money is put to good use. Okay? So then you very complicated landscape of how to navigate politics. So I call this political commensalism largely because it's not very clear if the merchants actually were hurt in any significant capacity. It's to be determined, right? So the relationship is changing, but we're not quite sure if the merchants are being hurt in the process. But certainly by phase 3, expedient extortion, the fortunes of the merchants change quite a bit. And a lot of this takes place in the Badra Fort. For those familiar with Ahmedabad, the Badra Fort is in the old city. And here's a picture of it. And again, as a bad historian, I did find my way sneaking into this particular monument. And up on the right is where the prison cell of the Badra Fort is. And this is where Shantidas Javeri's grandson, Kushal Chand, spent many unfortunate nights being imprisoned and being extorted. But don't feel too badly for him because he was not entirely innocent. And I'll tell you a bit more about that. Okay? So here's a context by the early 18th century where you have Kushal Chand Javeri, the grandson, pictured at the bottom. And you have a situation where the Mughal empire is on its way out. And as most declining firms, people working for the firm, especially the governors, are unsure the future of the firm and are now deciding whether they should defect from the Mughal empire, whether they should carve out their own independent domain, and what they should possibly do. It is in this context that the Mughal emperor himself is also confused, and he's sending multiple people to occupy the same post. Right? So for example, you hire 2 governors and you promise them pay, but when they go to Ahmedabad, they find somebody else already there and they're asked to fight it out. It is in this context that Kushal Chand identifies a beautiful opportunity, which is, why not money lend to both sides? Okay? So to give you an example of what that looks like from a Persian diary that I mentioned early on. So Hamid Khan, who happens to be the uncle of Nizamul Mulk, the founder of Hyderabad state, he tells Kushal Chand that 10 lakh rupees is required to pay the soldiers. And by the way, all money was used to pay soldiers. That was the reason that people needed the cash. Either raise the amount through illegal taxes, in the local language it's called biware, from the people, or give the amount from your own banking house. Okay? Just 2 weeks later, the paymaster of Hamid Khan was clamoring excessively. And through the acquaintance of Kushal Chand Jhaveri, the jeweler, 1 lakh rupees was raised in sums of 10,000s. That's lead lending. So he would go to other bankers in the city and use his reputation to gather these loans, small loan amounts. He would bundle them, and then he would offer them to Hamid Khan. Now, this is just one episode. I have at least 100 episodes like this, where large sums like this were being gathered by Kushal Chand and being offered to Hamid Khan. What's interesting, though, for our purposes, is that there's a lot of overlap between him giving this money to Hamid Khan and him giving this money to Sarbulan Khan, who was another rival governor. So Sarbulan Khan sends a message to Kushal Chand Jhaveri that money to pay soldiers is required. At this point, Kushal Chand realizes that maybe this money won't be repaid, and he says, other money lenders, grain merchants, they all have wealth. If you tell me, or if you order what they are capable of giving, I will raise it, and I will hand it over to you. So he's not promising any money from his own banking house. Sarbulan Khan becomes irritated at this reply and says, am I some enemy? Am I a rebel like Hamid Khan, the first governor? I'm a servant of the king's authority. I'm asking you for a loan. In exchange for that loan, you can take precious jewels from the government as collateral, and you can even take up to 25% on top of what you loan as interest. And, God willing, we will pay this back to you. Being a good banker, Kushal Chand was happy with this reply. He immediately offered 100,000 rupees from his own banking house and stayed back at Badra Fort. Now, this is the Persian material. The Gujarati material paints a slightly different picture. In fact, they're doubtful of Kushal Chand's character. And if you don't take away anything from my talk today, the one thing you should take away is that people are multifaceted. No single source can give you a unidimensional view of an individual, and there's no truth to any individual, including all of us in this particular room. So for a historian, the task is very difficult because you have to find multiple sources that shed light and that refract someone's character. And this is a very good example of that. So here's a Gujarati shlok written by Shamal Bhatt, and this is describing a battle that takes place. And Shamal Bhatt was an early 18th century Gujarati poet. Many different poems have been written by him, but this is an ethnographic, almost like a pavada, but it's a ballad where he's describing what is being seen. This is also interesting because Shamal Bhatt was not under any official patronage. In fact, he was quite impoverished, and it's only later on that he finds a patron that supports him. So this suggests that he's recording what is actually being observed. So here, at the bottom, it says there were two armies. These are the armies of Sarbulan Khan and Hamid Khan from the previous slide. They were fighting, and Kushal Chand turned and he opened the gates of the city wall for Hamid Khan to come in and loot Ahmedabad city. Okay? He promised Hamid Khan that he would allow him and he would show him the way into the city, and in effect, allowed this man to ransack the old city. So finally, the last line in the poem says, why are you sitting around? We have been cheated. Our banker Kushal Chand is a traitor. Now again, as I said, don't take anyone from any single perspective, but what I've tried to do in the book is amass a range of sources that tries to give you a sense of how complex a character is and what asymmetry of information they're faced with and the decisions that they make in the process. And it is for you as readers to decide who you like and who you dislike by the end of this tale, okay? But what I've argued in this book is that you see this money lending going on in both ways, in both directions, and this is something that is new in the political landscape in the early 18th century. We don't see that before this. And the final phase is what I'm calling competitive co-parcenary. And this is where we get to the fourth generation of the Jhaveri family. And that's Vakhat Chand Jhaveri. Incidentally, I found this picture, which is the cover of my book. It's a painting on the inner marble wall of an old, small Jain derasar in Ahmedabad city in Ratanpur, if anyone's familiar with Ahmedabad. And it's painted on the inner marble wall of the Jain temple. I found this painting about a month before my book was to be published. I knew it existed because I read about it in a book written by a very well-known historian of Gujarat in the early 20th century. But it took me 2 years to actually find the painting. And it's still there if you're interested. So I'm grateful to the pujaris there because there's no light inside. And thanks to a Google Pixel phone, I was able to have them hold 2 diyas up and capture a photograph, which became the cover of my book. So this is the only known physical description that we have of Vakhat Chand Javeri. And it is in this context that the Javeris identify the early East India Company, who was on the horizon, especially after the First Anglo-Maratha War in the late 18th century, as people who needed financial services and who might be able to safeguard the interests of the merchants. So to give you an example here, we have a letter from the East India Company, and all you want to take away from this is how important the Javeri family name was during that time. You know, today we have different ways of determining how creditworthy somebody is. You have a credit score, you have banking history, financial history, so on and so forth. But in that time period, it was your family's reputation and your family name, which I believe still holds true in India today, right, for certain businesses. So the Javeri had that name. And it says here, I have the honor to inform you that Malhar Rao, a member of the Gaikwad family, who was not doing very well and financially irresponsible, he offered Vakhat Chand Khushal Chand Javeri, a respectable merchant, as his security for the company's revenues. And the East India Company accepted this bond, deeming it one of the most unexceptionable in the country for the payment of this demand. So that gives you a sense of a shifting landscape. But again, that is the first half of the story, and unfortunately, for the Javeri family, after Vakhat Chand, there's a drop in sources. So I was not able to really find what happened after that. This just also tells you that there are pockets in Indian history where we have a lot of information, and other pockets where we don't, and it's not necessarily linear. So don't assume that if it's 19th century, we have a lot of material, and for earlier period, we have little material. That's not the case. It is uneven. To overcome this gap in evidence for this particular family, I went back to the archive that I started with. That is the Hari Bhakti archive in Baroda. And it is through that archive that I was able to identify gaps and tell the remainder of the story in terms of what happened to banking families in the aftermath. So here we have two very well-known bankers coming out of Baroda. This is Bhakti Das and Hari Das. And their name has been merged in modern-day parlance as Hari Bhakti. In fact, in the 19th century, the colonial state itself referred to the firm as Hari Bhakti. So this is an image that was given to me by members of the family in Baroda. Interestingly enough, when I approached the family, initially they said that they didn't have any materials and they don't really know much about the family history. Whatever was given was donated to the university. And I pushed as a historian, I said, being a fairly prominent family in the city and having such a big house, I'm quite sure you must have a chest that is very large somewhere, either in a go-down or in an attic somewhere, that you have not seen yet. Please check again. Please check again. So after multiple checks, a branch of this family said that, yes, our patriarch who passed away, they had some materials, but we never bothered to check. But after checking, we have found about 32 jute scrolls on which we have evidence from the 18th century documenting the family's history. So to give you a sense of what the family looks like here, and I'm happy that Shailesh Bhai is here too because you can see his name mentioned there on the left. It's an example of living history today, right? I mean, you can see how connected we are to our past. So it is these two branches of the family that donated materials or that we have evidence from. Shailesh Bhai, you may have to go home and check your family go down as well and see if you find any materials for me to study. But so initially the donation was made by Arvind Hari Bhakti to the university, and then it is Gopal and Swati Hari Bhakti's branch that identified these 30 extra jute scrolls in their family possession. Okay. So it is this family that was initially involved in money lending and in fact operating on behalf of the British East India Company because the East India Company did not have indigenous capacity. They did not have the administrative capacity to effect rule, but what they had was military might. So the threat of violence is a very, very strong motivator, but they relied on indigenous financiers like the Hari Bhaktis who actually had the financial knowledge and more importantly the financial infrastructure to be able to make change. The Hari Bhakti family was spread across Baroda, Surat, Pune and Mumbai, at least from what I've studied in the sources. And they had vast communication networks, including spies, informants, and news runners that were going back and forth between city to city. On average, it would take about 1 to 2 weeks for news to circulate between these four cities. So let me give you a sense of what the Hari Bhakti materials look like. And I must confess, I've only touched the iceberg. If anybody in this room is interested, either a student or a scholar, please be in touch with me. And there's a lot more work that can be done on this particular family. In fact, I think there's at least 2 good books that need to be written about the Hari Bhaktis on their own. And the materials are very plentiful. So just to give you a sense of what these look like, so that's the Hari Bhakti collection from the MS University, one branch of the family. And this is what I found in Swati Ben and Gopal Bhai's home, about 30 jute scrolls, which documented the early establishment of the family firm, which was 1762. We actually have a jute scroll that documents that. These are very large jute scrolls, written in Old Gujarati with no breakage between the words. It's pretty difficult to read. I must say I also got help in reading them because it's a very difficult task to read everything. So rather than going deep into the history of the Hari Bhakti, let me just give you a sense of how important the family was, not in my words, but in the words of a later member of the family. This is in the words of Magan Hari Bhakti, who was advocating to the British colonial courts that they restore the prestige and the land and the resources that the Hari Bhakti family had initially given to the British East India Company and to the local states. Unfortunately for the Hari Bhakti family, they were made false promises and they were left to dry in the sun on their own. But despite that, they recovered and they have had a pretty illustrious legacy after that. But it just tells you the business of money lending to political power, whether it's the Javaris or the Hari Bhaktis, is not an easy task. So let me tell you what Magan Hari Bhakti says in the colonial courts. He says the ancestors of His Highness the Gaikwad of Baroda looked upon this firm, the Hari Bhakti firm, as their own bankers, and feelings of mutual confidence and friendship grew very strong between them. The firm of Hari Bhakti, in the English language, was ever ready with its purse, anxious to lay all its capital at the disposal of the Gaikwad, and had once actually paid 80 lakh rupees to the Peshwa on behalf of the Gaikwad at a moment's notice. So they had immense capital to spend. The members of this famous firm were the staunch adherents of the Gaikwad in weal and woe, so through thick and thin, and their loyalty to the Gadi of the princely state of Baroda, often put to several trials, proved absolutely unshaken through thick and thin. These meritorious services were duly rewarded by the Gaikwads in appreciative spirit by the grant of several Inami villages, Asamis, which are a kind of grant, cash allowances, and the hereditary office of Portdar. So they were actually given the role of being the chief accountant and the chief financier of the Gaikwad state. Unfortunately for the Gaikwads, because they didn't manage their money very well, they had no money to repay the Hari Bhakti firm. And this is not the story of just the Hari Bhakti firm. Most business families in India in the 19th century faced immense challenges. Even the long-standing families that we say have a long lineage, entrepreneurship has never been easy. Every generation has had to pivot, and they have faced immense challenges. To give you one example, in the 19th century, the British colonial state outlawed indigenous currencies in favor of a single currency. This is a world that operated in multiple currencies, a world that believed in commodity money, so the inherent value of the silver was as good as what was stamped on it. But this entire indigenous world of banking was clamped down on pretty hard. And so if you look at the Hari Bhakti materials very closely, you will see that on their end, despite maintaining meticulous records and entering agreements, and I would say quite earnestly, institutions were not robust enough to actually honor those claims and honor those relationships and contractual obligations. So this book ends here, but another story has to be told about how these family firms have pivoted, how they've recovered, and if there's ruptures in their lineage, who is responsible for recatalyzing and reigniting the family firm. Now, as far as academic debates go, if you want a punchline for the book, and this is my last slide, it is in the process of Mughal dissolution or Mughal decline that bankers were first implicated, then extorted, and then finally adapted to new political circumstances to not only grow their businesses, but also use the power of finance to shape political possibilities. So even though at the level of n equals 1, a business might have failed, what emerged broadly in this story is probably a big win for business, which is that principles of finance now entered how states were run, the idea of financial futures became an important concept in sort of arbitrating power between different groups. And finally, as the landscape pluralized and more people wanted a piece of the pie, financiers were at the center of the story. I believe that the story continues in full form after this period too. So if you think about the first industrialists in India in the 19th century, in Ahmedabad, for example, or even Mumbai, they relied on each other for capital and know-how, and they pooled resources in very innovative ways to build first industries. They were involved in the building of municipal governance in places like Mumbai and Ahmedabad. They were always at the forefront of change, and it is when they stopped pivoting and when they stopped being entrepreneurial that they often face challenges. So a story for another time would be how each generation, family businesses cannot take what they have for granted and must always look for new opportunities to grow their businesses and take on new challenges. Thank you very much for being here.